guys, back again, round two with a video not so much on the history and politics of the rise of the Sasanian Persians, but more on their governance structure. I'm going to do something in this video that I usually murder students for doing in their papers. I'm going to organize it a little bit as a detective novel. What I mean by that is I'm not going to tell you the big idea. Rather, I'm going to try to set some evidence before you and ask you to come to class on Thursday with an understanding or a sort of hypothesis. When people study Sasanian Persia for the first time, myself included, they're often struck by some of the unusual aspects of its legal system, of its treatment of women and sexuality, of the organization of its classes and commerce. And so rather than giving you the answer of sort of telling you this is the core principle or this is the core logic, as I said at the top, I'm gonna sort of talk about a few core themes of Sasanian governance. And then when we reunite on Thursday, I'd love to kind of hear how you can make some of these apparently contradictory aspects of Persian culture work together. So yes, today's lecture, in the second video, not so much the emperors themselves, but what is the governance structure of the Aryan people, and what's the organizing principle that holds it all together? In order to grasp this, you really are going to have to leave behind a Western or Romanized way of seeing the world and think a little bit more based on the geography, the history, the economics of the Persian Empire to think through what is it that sort of undergirds or founds all of these various principles together. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Within this great mystery novel style video, I'm going to talk about 5 core themes, some of which I'll spend a little more time on, others which I'll just have a slide or two, because I know YouTube videos, especially grainy ones like this, can be a little long, and I don't want to lose your attention too early in the process. So the 5 core themes we'll be looking at, I'm going to start with the concept of class divisions. That came through loud and clear in the Darai reading. That was the whole sort of first half of the first perusal PDF. We will also look at the economics of the empire and some of the unusual ways that I think the Persians are structuring oversight or free market approaches to the economy. We'll look at habits of the elite and how we know about them. And then we'll sort of close by combining legal restrictions and women and sexual mores, which I think Western people find really odd and unusual and even sometimes offensive. But again, if you get the core principle by the end of this video, I think it will help you make sense of why some things are really tolerated and even encouraged in Sasanian sexual culture and others punishable even by death. Okay, so let's get started with class divisions, and I hope in my next slide you'll kind of remember this from some of your reading on that big first section in Darai. So even to a greater extent than the Roman world, which certainly does have classes, especially in late antiquity, in the imperial family, senatorial families, equestrians, citizens, non-citizens, slaves and women. Boy, it really kills you in ancient history. Slaves and women, like across civilizations, are almost always at the bottom, except for Egypt. So there's that. But anyway, even to a greater extent than this sort of Roman stratification, the Sasanian Persian world is deeply stratified. There are 4 main sort of substrates or classes within its populace. And whereas the Roman world seems to at least offer at least a little bit of a pathway to advancement, right? You could, in the early Roman Empire, be from a few generations out from a freedman family and work your way up into the senatorial class like Cicero. There isn't much evidence in Sasanian Persia of people jumping classes within a few generations. So these stratifications are pretty strict. Of course, at the very, very top, we have the Sasanian Persian emperor himself and his royal family. Sometimes this royal family could be pretty huge. Sasanian emperors were frequently polygamous and had multiple wives and multiple children. So you could be looking at, upwards of 20 children within that royal court. And boy, does that make it fun when daddy dies and everybody fights over the throne. But beyond the crown, right, beyond the royal family itself, we have at the top tier, the priestly class, a massive bureaucratic organization of priests. And when we think about priests, you really have to think of them along a class spectrum, right? Kind of like medieval Christianity, right? You have the Pope at the very, very top. You have a super elite class of priests. And then you also have at the very bottom of the priestly hierarchy, the priest who is stationed out in the most remote part of southern Mongolia, who is trying to, service, the most rural parts of the community. So the priestly class really runs a big spectrum. But religion plays a massive role in Sasanian Persian culture. And whereas the Roman world is highly polytheistic, and therefore there isn't one sort of religious structure that organizes or collaborates with politics, that's not true in the Sasanian Persian Empire. Politics and religion are deeply woven together within their world, even to the extent that the Sasanian Persian emperor has to keep priests happy. And we see evidence that when that relationship between the royal family and the priestly bureaucracy comes into conflict, that's where we get political upheaval, right? The king and the priesthood are mutually supporting, but that really requires the emperor himself to be a good representative of the interests of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of Persia. A little bit further down the tier, we have the warrior class. Again, another big organizational bureaucracy. We have cavalrymen, we have infantrymen, we have naval warriors. This, I think, indicates that military service was not sort of a short-lived thing, but among the most elite warriors, a lifetime occupation, right? You made your way through the world as a Persian warrior. The next two classes down, I want to be clear that in these categories, we are not talking about average common people. The average lower class populace doesn't really fall into these categories, but we have breeders and farmers. Breeders, sometimes called husbandmen. It means just, people who breed and care for livestock, horses, cattle, goats, sheep, the works. And then the final tier are artisans and merchants. These last two categories, I just want to be clear, these are not the lower classes. These are people who own big farms or big businesses or big workshops. And what's striking about this is that the artisan and merchant class is below the farming and breeding class, which is something different, I think, than we would see in the Greco-Roman world, where the farmers or the agricultural peasantry sort of occupy the bottom tier. But the Sasanian Persian literature and inscriptions often indicates a certain skepticism of commercial endeavors. So merchants and tradesmen are occasionally characterized as being sort of sneaky, tricky, whereas farmers and livestock breeders are the kind of backbone of the Persian economy. Within these classes, I would like to zoom in on two particular aspects that I think are worth mentioning, which is that, first of all, in the warrior class, it's really the cavalry that holds the place of pride. These are, heavily chain-mailed horses. When I think Sasanian Persian cavalry, I actually think more of like medieval knights, right? Having a big stable of horses, really being the heavy hitter on the battlefield. Imagine that you are the Roman army, which is primarily trained in infantry warfare, facing down just a wall of heavily armored Persian cavalry. That's what makes the Persian military tick. And horsemanship had been a critical trait of good leadership, or a symbol of good leadership, all the way back to the time of the Achaemenid Persians. So not all warriors are made equal within this class, and it's really the wealthier knight-like warriors who are able to fund a big stable and a big training program of cavalry-based warfare that rise to the top. I really have to emphasize that cavalry warfare is an incredibly skilled craft, right? I'm not a military historian, so put me behind Dr. Schneid, whatever he says is right. But, I can take a group of men with some, sort of fighting or ground warfare experience, and in a matter of months, I can train them to sort of fight as one, or phalanx style warfare like we see in the ancient Greek world. But cavalry warfare has to be much more coordinated. You really have to be someone who grew up in a family of means from a young age in order to acquire the seat and the facility with horsemanship. This is why games like polo and horseback archery are also so prominent even today in Mongolian culture, or some Middle Eastern cultures, because of that long enduring relationship between riding horses and mastering the art of horse-based warfare. So that's important. That's one of the clues I'm giving you here in this mystery lecture, that horses are critical to Persian military success. The second thing that I think is worth mentioning, which appears on page 47 of the Dari reading, is the heavy government oversight over breeders and farmers. And this is kind of surprising for several reasons, but that perhaps more than any other industry, if the Persian government is going to interfere or have oversight, it's really over foodstuffs and the breeding of animals. The farming class was the tax base for the empire. It's where the state is going to draw a lot of its financial resources. And for that reason, there is a big bureaucratic apparatus in the Sasanian Empire to survey, to tax, to estimate, to test the fertility or the productivity of certain lands. And I like this, that it also has a religious component. In Zoroastrian religion, letting land sit idle is a sin. Again, that's another big clue here to one of the organizing principles of the Sasanian Persian Empire, which is the importance of land and the importance of government oversight into that land. The exact opposite is true if we turn away from the agricultural economy of the Persian Empire and instead turn more to the realm of trade and commerce. I've already mentioned that the artisan class or the merchant class was sort of looked down upon as being untrustworthy or sneaky. But it is striking to me as a historian just how little interest the Persians seem to have in the economics of trade and commerce. I liked this. I'm not sure quite what page this is from. I should have put it down, maybe page 48, but I'll read it off here. It appears that the government was never involved in opening economic markets or actively engaged in business, but rather private corporations were to be the major proponents of trade. The royal family and the noble classes of ancient Persia are not interfering on a government basis with trade. There's maybe some taxation set up on toll roads of the Persian Empire. This is one area in which they are somewhat similar to the Romans of the late Roman Republic. We see Roman senators avoiding becoming openly involved in commerce and trade because of its lower class affiliations, right? It's thought to be ignoble to dirty your hands with sort of commercial ventures or commercial enterprises. But I have to say, again, as an American, just the strangeness that it is farming and livestock breeding that gets heavy taxation and heavy oversight versus commerce and trade, which is much more sort of hands-off free market. I can really imagine like Bernie Sanders screaming that like, wait a minute, you're going to tax farmers, but you're going to leave open commerce? Like that would never fly in the US. And indeed it wouldn't. I don't think there's either a Republican or a Democrat who would run on the platform of, hey, let's heavily tax our farmers, but we're going to let the corporations do whatever the heck they want, right? That would never fly in the States. But again, think back to the fact that this lecture is about trying to get at the heart of a mystery. What does it tell you that the Sasanian Persians are really keeping a tight look and a tight lid on farming, but letting commerce and trade sort of do whatever it wants? All right, I want to shift gears now away from classes and class structure and economics to some of the more cultural aspects of the Sasanian Empire. And here I'd like to start with the elite classes and the noble families. This is the group of people in the Sasanian world for whom we have the most evidence, Because, of course, like most societies, literature, history writing, inscriptions, these tend to be produced within elite communities and elite families. And what we know of the Persian court or the Persian nobility is that it looks a lot like the sort of literary court structure of what we think of as medieval Europe. A really heavy emphasis on banquet halls with hundreds, maybe even thousands of participants as the central cultural hub. And furthermore, as the Sasanian Persian emperor passes through the various regions of his empire, there's the expectation that satraps will host him and will sort of put on these great cultural gatherings. Within this feasting culture is a real emphasis on, obviously, on food, but more importantly, on the quantity of protein served. So you know you're an elite when you can eat meat with every meal. Raising a cow, raising a sheep or a goat to adulthood, that's a hard thing to do. It takes years. So it's really only the elite classes who are consuming a lot of meat, freshly killed meat. And so nobility and noble families sort of display their wealth by the sheer amount of meat that they can put on the table. Another thing that the Persian court is really well known for is diversity of food types. So if you know that you are having the Sasanian emperor coming to your palace to feast, one of the ways you show your cultural access and power is the sheer diversity of food, right? I'm going to bring in, fruits from India. I'm going to bring in dates from Judea. I'm going to bring in hens from Armenia. And in this way, food itself becomes a symbol of imperial power, the ability to eat from all sorts of cultures, right? To bring the rich produce of the world to you. That actually reminds me a little bit, frankly, of American culture because, here we do have a sense of an American cuisine, but what we really have, especially in our urban centers, is this diversity of international cuisine, right? Chinese food, Korean food, dim sum, Indian, cuisine, Mexican cuisine, South American cuisine, and it shows you the sort of imperial power. It is not the case that if you go to remote parts of Africa or the Middle East, that you also have all of these different cuisines at your fingertips. Even though all of these places, of course, have their own rich cuisines to offer, food in and itself can become a symbol of imperialism. And certainly we see that in the British Empire and other empires as well. Sasanian court nobility and this feasting culture also gave rise to a pretty rich tradition of performance genres, music, dance, poetry. I am not really an expert in medieval Persia. I hesitate to call myself an expert in any type of Persian culture. But what I can tell you is that a lot of the literature that survives from 10th, 11th, and 12th century Persia is court poetry and court chroniclers. And that's because even in the Sasanian Empire, there is a sort of symbiotic relationship between the court nobility and its feasting and banqueting culture and the production of genres and literature and art and dance culture specifically meant to interweave with court nobility. So, I think we often think of the West as being the sort of cultural center of civilization. That's very much not the case. The Sasanian Persians have their own rich literary traditions, which we'll only really begin to see evidence of starting in the 900s AD. What were people doing when they weren't feasting? Well, the main source of evidence we have for this is about hunting and the importance of hunting culture within elite sort of courts of the Sasanian Empire. I love this little quote from Darai that kings hunted on horses, they hunted on boats, and it's not like the king just kind of rides out into the sunset by himself. He is accompanied by this massive trousseau of elephants, attendants, music players. The sheer number of hunt scenes that we get from Sasanian Persia tells you that when the king wished to represent himself to the common viewer, somebody who couldn't read, The main trope in which he did so was in a hunting scene. We see that on this inscribed silver plate on the left, in which it looks like the Sasanian emperor is firing that classic arrow over the back of his horse into a lion's head. And then in this scene, this one is from the sort of middle Sasanian Empire. I can't remember who this is. It might be one of the Yazdegirds. But he looks like he's fighting on the back of a dromedary or a camel with somebody else in tow. And I think that the symbolic reasoning for these sorts of hunt scenes are to show two things, which are interconnected. The first, of course, is horsemanship, right? The ability to hunt wild beasts within the forests or the plains is in itself analogous to the Persian emperor's savvy on the battlefield, of course, with a cavalry mount, but also because hunting in and of itself is a supreme display of mastery over the wilderness, right? To go out into the wild, to show your ability as a man to conquer all the wild varieties of animals of the world. Nonetheless, though, and I think that I'm also drawing from my experience as someone who's married to a hunter, even as hunting is about taming the natural world, it's also an appreciation for the natural world, right? Persian kings have a lot of laws, a lot of territories, heavily regulated places where the wild is allowed to grow up and to thrive, specifically because any good hunter wants to preserve untouched places where you get to interact with the sort of wildlife and the wild animals at the core of the hunt. So there's a real ecological relationship, a paradox of both taming the wild, but also allowing the wild to thrive, which again, another clue for understanding the Sasanian Persians. Okay, at this stage in my video, I only have about 2 slides left, and I'd like to focus here now on sort of women and regulations. They really do go hand in hand because women are some of the most highly regulated members of the Sasanian Persian Empire. But laws governing female sexuality are also, I think, a key hint to how the Sasanians think of themselves and think of the source of their success. One thing I always bristle against is when sometimes students talk about women as, oh, the poor downtrodden and enslaved women of the ancient world. Certainly there's a lot of that, right? There's no doubt that the patriarchy exists in ancient times. But I think it's important to try to understand the role of women within their own culture and their own time. And to also respect that there was almost certainly a diversity of experiences for women in the same way that there is today. We know that queens in the royal court of the Persians actually held immense political power all the way back to the time of the Achaemenids. And so elite Persian women were educated. They knew poetry, right? Many of them spoke several languages. Women on the very bottom of the societal tier, there are slave women. There are women in brothels. And so the diversity of experience of what it meant to be a woman in the ancient world should be respected and discussed as something nuanced. I've read one too many essays from students saying, women were chained to the stovetop in ancient kitchens. And that's really a trope that deserves much more sophistication. That said, women at just about every class of Sasanian Empire were held to a number of societal norms. And I want to pause for just a minute to let you take in this slide I've created. Here I've really drawn from the Darai reading, and I've gone through several of the regulations that he mentions, and I've kind of categorized them into 3 tiers: acceptable, punishable by fine, and punishable by death. I'd like to encourage you here for a moment to just put me on pause and sort of work your way through some of these categories. Okay, I hope you took me up on that offer to pause me, but in case you haven't, I'm going to press on here. And I want to emphasize that to an outsider, especially to a Westerner, these could seem really confusing. It is acceptable for elite men to have multiple wives. It's acceptable to divorce a barren woman or a woman who commits an act of adultery or a woman who's a proven sorceress. It's acceptable to have incestuous marriages. This is primarily in super elite families who want to concentrate their political power. It's also acceptable, again, pretty exclusively among elite families to share a young wife. So if we have a very old man married to a very young but fertile woman, were certain instances in Persian culture where that wife could be shared with another younger male member of the family in order to grow the sort of production of children within that elite class. Now, as we move into the things that are off the table, we have categories of punishable by fine and punishable by death. And these really often kind of throw people for a loop. So punishable by fine, which, crimes that can be compensated with money, rape, and there were specific prices or specific financial penalties given the status of the woman you raped. Was she a virgin? Was she high class? Was she low class? Was she a slave? All of that matters in the calculation of the penalty. Kidnapping of women, a trend which is still practiced, although relatively rarely in some parts of Central Asia, the bride kidnap. Sex before wedlock, sex with a sterile woman. Sorry, I'm missing a word there. Anal or oral sex, sort of classified under sodomy, with an opposite sex partner. So oral sex, male to female or female to male, and masturbation. This list is pretty wild and confusing to a lot of students, but what we're essentially seeing is that having sex in and of itself is not a crime punishable by death. But having sex in a way that won't necessarily produce legitimate children or isn't authorized to produce legitimate children, that's punishable. So anal and oral sex are punishable because, at least in theory, they don't produce children, right? Masturbation is punishable by a fine because it doesn't produce children. Rape, sex before wedlock very much have the ability to produce children, but not necessarily legitimate children. So sex in and of itself is not the problem. It's sex outside the confines of producing legitimate heirs. Punishable by death, this is certainly the more extreme category, homosexuality. Whereas in the Greco-Roman world, homosexuality is much more tolerated. In Sasanian Persia, homosexuality is a crime punishable by death, not only because it doesn't produce legitimate children, but because it produces pollution. And that's a theme we see coming up again and again in descriptions of sexual mores and things that are not to be tolerated. Women refusing marriage altogether. This is where women get lumped into the category of sorceress or witch. Again, right, it threatens to sort of overturn the entire model of productivity. And menstruation. There is so much regulation of menstruation. This is something, again, that's common both in Greek culture and in Roman culture. Women who are menstruating thought to be unclean or to have the ability to pollute their lands or their household or their religious communities. And so the threat of pollution is something that the Sasanian Persians take very seriously. And that's where I'd like to connect to my next slide. But I would really like to encourage you once more that, take a look at that list of the sort of categories and think what's the organizing principle here? Why are some things acceptable and others not acceptable? This concept of pollution and the dangers of pollution extends beyond menstruation and even sexual activity into other aspects of regulation in the Sasanian Empire. We see, really, unlike the Greco-Roman world, heavy regulation of the ecological resources of the Sasanian Persian Empire. In the same way that a woman could be thought to pollute her household by menstruation, any sort of unapproved cutting of trees, pollution of streams or lakes with trash or the dead, unapproved hunting, right, sort of polluting the natural wildlife, all of these are heavily regulated. And a lot of this regulation is coming from the religious bureaucracy. So priests appointed to worship or oversee the sanctuaries of river gods. Those who are, as priests, designated to take care of the fertility or the productivity of the land, or preserve the woodlands or the plains. So all of this massive priesthood has their own designated spheres of gods to keep happy, and any interference in the ecological balance without prior authorization from these religious authorities constitutes pollution. The fears about pollution, especially of the land, also lead us to what is considered by outsiders to be one of the strangest aspects of Persian Zoroastrian religion, which is the refusal to bury the dead. Now, I want to qualify here that in Greco-Roman culture, leaving a dead body out to be exposed to the elements is considered the greatest insult. So much so that in Homer's Iliad, we sometimes see this as a threat that the Greeks will say to the Trojans or vice versa. I'm going to kill you and I'm going to leave your body out to be consumed by wild dogs and vultures. In Persian culture, however, in Zoroastrian culture, this is exactly the procedure for how you deal with a dead body. You lovingly clean and care for your loved one, and then you leave them exposed to the elements. It was not considered an insult to leave a dead body in Persian culture, out to be eaten by the wild, because it was thought that animals will consume the dead body, vultures will consume the dead body, and that is how we avoid the polluting of the land itself by putting a rotting corpse into it. Now, obviously, leaving dead bodies out in the open raises some organizational problems. And for this reason, Zoroastrian religion developed what are known as towers of silence, which are these sort of communal pits where dead bodies could be laid out, in an open air setting in which they would gradually decompose, be eaten, the liquids would kind of drain. And these towers of silence, some of them, a handful, still exist to this day in modern India. I don't know if there's many left in Iran itself. And the principle here, and this is also how Christians and Jews sometimes dealt with it, is that the Persian law is that you cannot put a dead body in the soil, but you can put it within a stone sort of container as long as the body itself is not going to come in contact with the soil. So when Christians and Jews had their loved ones die, obviously those are not cultures that believe in leaving your dead out to the elements, right? Christians especially are very concerned with the resurrection. And if you leave your loved ones out to be consumed by wild animals, who knows if they will be resurrected in the afterlife? So what Christians and Jews would do would often be to build tombs or mausoleums where the dead body could be deposited. We know, Zoroastrians, on the other hand, create these towers of silence with this open air that allows the body to decompose in the natural elements without, just sort of putting people in a wild field. All right, I've been going for 32 minutes here, and I think that that's about as much time as anybody can listen to a YouTube video. So I'm going to wrap up here by leaving you guys with this. Now that you know all of these various aspects of Persian culture, heavy emphasis on the cavalry, heavy emphasis on hunting and ecological preservation of territories for hunting, laws about not putting your dead bodies into the land, laws about heavily restricting or regulating the fertility of women and the types of sex that will most promote fertility, a noble culture of banqueting and feasting, of celebrating the produce of the land, and of a class structure in which the priesthood occupies the top, the cavalry plays an important part of the warrior class, and in which breeders and farmers are the most heavily regulated part of the economy. What does that add up to? What is the governing principle of Persian law and society? All right, I really look forward to seeing you guys all on Thursday. Hang in there and have a great rest of your week. Talk to you soon.